The strangest thing happened to me last week. It started innocuously enough, as all strange things do, with an old newspaper article. It was about the house on Miller Street, an address that had haunted my childhood. Back then, the house was legendary among kids in my neighborhood. We'd whisper tales of the people who had lived there and the tragic end they supposedly met. But now, it was just an abandoned relic, slated for demolition to make way for a new apartment complex. I had convinced myself that it was curiosity that drove me to visit the house one last time, to see if the ghosts of my past still lingered. I drove there on a whim, parking my car at the end of the overgrown driveway. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, and the once manicured garden was a jungle of weeds. The house loomed ahead, its windows like vacant eyes watching my every move. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I shook it off and stepped forward. The front door, surprisingly, creaked open with a gentle push, as if it had been waiting for someone to visit. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of mildew and dust. The once grand foyer was now a shadow of its former self, cobwebs draped across the chandelier and dust motes dancing in the sunlight streaming through broken windows. My footsteps echoed ominously as I ventured further into the house. I walked through rooms that seemed frozen in time, furniture draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. I turned a corner and found myself in the living room, where a grand piano stood covered in dust. I remembered the stories of Mrs. Thompson, the house's last resident, who played the piano beautifully until the day she vanished. I approached the piano, feeling a strange compulsion to lift the sheet. As I did, a cold breeze swept through the room, sending chills down my spine. I hesitated, but then placed my fingers on the keys. A dissonant chord echoed through the house, breaking the silence. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. Just an old piano, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. But then I heard it, a faint, melodious tune coming from somewhere deep within the house. My heart pounded as I followed the sound, each step more hesitant than the last. The music led me to the basement door. I hesitated, but the music grew louder, almost beckoning me to follow. I opened the door and descended the creaky wooden steps into the darkness below. The basement was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was colder, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I followed the music to an old phonograph in the corner, its turntable spinning slowly, playing a haunting melody. But there was no record on it. As I approached, the music stopped abruptly, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the shadows, stood a figure, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes empty and hollow. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was rooted to the spot. She raised a hand, and the music started again, this time louder, more intense. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as she slowly moved towards me. Just as she was about to reach me, the basement door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. The music stopped, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to find my way back to the stairs. I raced up the steps, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the top, I found the door was locked. I pounded on it, shouting for help, but there was no response. Panic set in, and I turned back towards the basement. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread remained. I felt like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room, and then I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the far end of the basement, watching me with hollow eyes. With a surge of adrenaline, I kicked the door, throwing all my weight against it until it finally gave way. I stumbled into the foyer, gasping for air, and ran out of the house without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house standing silent and imposing, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The house on Miller Street had its secrets, and whatever haunted its halls wasn't bound by the physical world. I haven't been able to sleep since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that haunting melody, and see those hollow eyes watching me. I don't know what I unleashed that night, but I fear it followed me home. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home from the house on Miller Street. The eerie melody seemed to echo in the corners of my mind, especially at night. My dreams were plagued by visions of the woman in the old-fashioned dress, her hollow eyes staring into mine. I tried to distract myself with work and friends, but the unsettling sensation lingered. One evening, as I sat in my living room, flipping through channels mindlessly, I heard a faint sound that made my blood run cold. It was the melody from the phonograph, playing softly, almost imperceptibly, in the background. I muted the TV and strained to listen. The music was coming from upstairs. I stood, heart pounding, and made my way to the second floor. The melody grew louder as I approached my bedroom. I pushed open the door and found my phone on the nightstand, the source of the haunting tune. But it wasn't playing anything. I picked up the phone, my hands shaking. As soon as I touched it, the music stopped. The room fell silent, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Breathing heavily, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick my mind was playing on me after the terrifying experience at the house. But deep down, I knew it was something more. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning as the visions of the woman and the haunting melody invaded my thoughts. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, feeling like I was being watched. I glanced at the clock. It was 3:03 a.m. The room was dark, but I could make out a faint shadow in the corner. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, the shadow moved towards me, taking on a familiar shape. It was the woman from the basement. I scrambled out of bed, backing up against the wall. The woman stopped at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes fixed on me. She raised her hand, and the music started again, louder this time, filling the room with its haunting melody. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She took another step towards me, and I felt a cold breeze brush past my face. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and I could see my breath in the air. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she pointed to the window. I turned to look and saw a faint light flickering outside. It was coming from the direction of Miller Street. With a sudden burst of courage, I grabbed my phone and bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. The night was eerily quiet as I made my way towards the source of the light. As I approached Miller Street, I saw that the house was illuminated, a soft glow emanating from the windows. I stood in front of the house, feeling a strange compulsion to go inside. The front door, which had been slightly ajar during my last visit, was now wide open, as if inviting me in. I took a deep breath and stepped over the threshold. The house was different this time. The air was still musty, but there was a new sense of foreboding. I followed the light to the living room, where the grand piano stood uncovered. The keys were moving on their own, playing the haunting melody I had heard so many times. I walked towards the piano, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There were photographs scattered across the top of the piano. They were old, black and white pictures of a family. In one of them, I recognized the woman from the basement, standing next to a man and a young boy. I picked up one of the photographs, studying the faces. The woman's expression was solemn, almost sad. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the boy in the photo looked eerily similar to me as a child. A sudden noise from upstairs made me drop the photo. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the second floor. I hesitated for a moment, but then felt a strange compulsion to follow the sound. As I ascended the stairs, the footsteps grew louder. I reached the top and saw a door at the end of the hallway slightly ajar, a faint light seeping through the crack. I walked towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and found myself in a bedroom. The room was meticulously preserved, as if untouched by time. There was an old bed with a floral quilt, a vanity with a mirror, and a wardrobe in the corner. The light was coming from a lamp on the nightstand. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around and tried to open it, but it was locked. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. Then I heard it again, the melody from the phonograph, playing softly in the background. I turned towards the vanity and saw the reflection of the woman in the mirror. She was standing right behind me, her hollow eyes staring into mine. She raised her hand, and the music grew louder. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. The room started to spin, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I stumbled back, trying to keep my balance, and bumped into the wardrobe. It creaked open, revealing a hidden staircase leading down into the darkness. I didn't want to go, but something compelled me to descend. As I made my way down the narrow steps, the music faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The staircase led to a small, hidden room. In the center of the room was an old, dusty chest. I felt an inexplicable urge to open it. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of old letters, photographs, and a small, intricately carved box. I picked up the box and opened it, revealing a locket inside. I opened the locket and gasped. Inside was a photograph of the woman and the boy from the pictures. And on the other side, a photo of me as a child. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The woman was my grandmother, and the boy was my father. This house had once belonged to my family. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I had to get out of there. I turned to leave, but the staircase had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. The room grew colder, and I felt the presence of the woman behind me once again. I clutched the locket, feeling a strange sense of connection to her. She wasn't trying to harm me. She was trying to tell me something. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My grandmother had lived in this house, and my father had grown up here. But why hadn't anyone told me? What had happened to them? The questions buzzed in my mind, but I had no time to ponder. The air in the hidden room grew frigid, and the oppressive silence pressed down on me. Clutching the locket, I turned to face the solid wall where the staircase had been. There had to be a way out. I ran my hands over the cold stone surface, searching for any sign of an exit. My fingers brushed against a small hidden latch. With a surge of hope, I pulled it. The wall slid open with a creak, revealing another dark corridor. The air here was even colder, and an unsettling feeling gnawed at my gut. I stepped into the corridor, my breath visible in the frosty air. The walls were lined with old family portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. As I moved deeper into the corridor, I noticed something strange. The faces in the portraits began to change. They were morphing into distorted, grotesque versions of themselves. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached the end of the corridor, where a heavy wooden door loomed before me. The door was adorned with intricate carvings, depicting scenes of anguish and sorrow. I hesitated, but the feeling of being watched propelled me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped into a vast, dimly lit room. The room was filled with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface tarnished and cracked. I approached the mirror, feeling a strange compulsion to look into it. As I did, the reflection that stared back at me was not my own. I saw the woman again, but this time, her eyes were filled with sorrow rather than emptiness. She reached out a hand towards the mirror, as if trying to communicate with me. I placed my hand against the glass, and a cold shock ran through me. Images flashed before my eyes, memories that were not my own. I saw the woman, my grandmother, holding my father as a baby, smiling and happy. Then, the images grew darker. I saw my grandfather, a stern and imposing figure, shouting at my grandmother. There was fear in her eyes, and the house seemed to shudder with their arguments. The final image was the most disturbing. I saw my grandmother standing in the basement, the same basement where I had found the phonograph. She was crying, clutching the locket, and behind her, a shadowy figure loomed. It was the same figure I had seen in my nightmares, with hollow eyes and a menacing presence. The connection broke, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The mirror's surface rippled and then shattered, the fragments falling to the ground. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around to find the shadowy figure standing before me. "Leave this place," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "You do not belong here." I backed away, but the figure advanced, its hollow eyes piercing into mine. Desperation gripped me as I looked around for an escape. My eyes fell on a small door in the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of old books. I bolted towards the door, throwing it open and stepping into another narrow passage. The figure's presence was close behind me, and I could feel its cold breath on my neck. I ran down the passage, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The passage led to a spiral staircase, winding down into darkness. I descended as quickly as I could, the shadowy figure's whispers growing louder in my ears. The staircase seemed endless, but finally I reached the bottom and found myself in a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center of the chamber was an old wooden chest, similar to the one I had found in the hidden room. The chest was locked, but a key hung from a rusted chain on the wall. I grabbed the key and unlocked the chest, my hands trembling. Inside, I found more letters and photographs, but these were different. They were letters from my grandmother to my father, filled with love and sorrow. She had written them after he had been taken away by my grandfather, who had blamed her for some unknown tragedy. As I read through the letters, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. My grandmother had been driven mad by the loss of her family, and the shadowy figure was a manifestation of her grief and guilt. She'd been trapped in this house, haunted by her memories and unable to move on. A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts. The shadowy figure was standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes fixed on me. But this time, I felt no fear. I understood now. The figure was not here to harm me. It was a part of my grandmother's tormented spirit, seeking release. I held up the locket, feeling a surge of determination. "I know who you are," I said, my voice steady. "You're my grandmother, and I'm here to help you." The figure hesitated, its form wavering. I took a step forward, holding the locket out. "You don't have to be trapped here anymore. You can let go. I'll take your letters to my father. I'll make sure he knows how much you loved him." The figure's hollow eyes filled with tears, and it began to dissolve, the darkness lifting. The room grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling vanished. I felt a sense of peace wash over me as the shadowy figure faded into nothingness. I stood alone in the chamber, holding the locket and the letters. The house was silent, the air clear. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew that I had fulfilled my grandmother's last wish. I had brought closure to her tormented spirit. As I made my way back through the house, I felt a sense of closure within myself. The haunting melody was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. I left the house on Miller Street, the weight of its dark history lifted from my shoulders. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. There were still questions to be answered, and I knew that my journey was far from over. The house had revealed its secrets, but there was still more to uncover. I returned home, feeling lighter, but still haunted by the echoes of my family's past. The next morning, I decided to confront my father. He had never spoken of his childhood, and now I understood why. I needed answers, and I needed him to know what I had found. I called him and arranged to meet at his house. The drive over was filled with a sense of anticipation and dread. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly, but I could see the curiosity in his eyes. We sat down in his living room, and I placed the letters and locket on the table between us. "What's all this?" he asked, picking up the locket and examining it. I took a deep breath and began to explain everything. The house on Miller Street, the haunting melody, the hidden room, and the letters from his mother. As I spoke, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to sorrow. "I had no idea," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I always thought my mother had abandoned me. My father never spoke of her after we left. he made her out to be a villain. She loved you, I said gently, handing him the letters. She never stopped loving you. She was trapped in that house, tormented by the loss of her family and by something dark and sinister. But I think she's at peace now. He took the letters and began to read, tears streaming down his face. I watched as decades of pain and misunderstanding melted away. When he finished, he looked at me with a newfound determination. "We need to go back," he said. "There's more to this story, and we need to uncover the truth." Reluctantly, I agreed. We drove back to the house on Miller Street, arriving just as the sun began to set. The house looked different in the evening light, less menacing, but still holding an air of mystery. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under our weight. My father led the way, moving with a sense of purpose. We retraced my steps from the previous night, starting in the living room. He paused by the grand piano, running his fingers over the dusty keys. "This was her pride and joy," he said softly. "She used to play for hours, losing herself in the music." I watched him, feeling a pang of sadness. He had been robbed of so many memories, so much love. We moved on, exploring the other rooms, searching for any clues that might explain what had happened to my grandmother. In the basement, we found the phonograph, now silent and still. My father knelt beside it, his hands trembling. "This was her favorite song," he murmured. "She used to play it for me when I was a child." He stood up, looking around the room. "There's something we're missing," he said. "Something important." We went back to the hidden room, where I had found the chest. My father examined the photographs and letters, looking for any details we might have overlooked. Then, he noticed something strange about one of the portraits on the wall. It was a painting of my grandmother, but there was a small keyhole at the bottom of the frame. He took the key from the chest and inserted it into the keyhole. With a click, the frame swung open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, there was an old journal, bound in leather and covered in dust. My father opened the journal, and we began to read together. It was my grandmother's diary, detailing her life in the house and the events that had led to her torment. The more we read, the more we realized how deep the mystery went. One entry stood out among the rest. It described a night when my grandfather had returned home late, drunk and angry. He had accused my grandmother of something terrible, something that had driven her to the brink of madness. The entry ended abruptly with a single chilling sentence. "He made a pact with something dark, and now we are all doomed." We looked at each other, the weight of the revelation sinking in. My grandfather had brought something into the house, something that had tormented my grandmother and torn our family apart. We needed to find out what it was and put an end to its curse. As we continued reading, the house seemed to grow colder, and the shadows deepened. We found another entry that mentioned a hidden room in the attic, a place where my grandfather had conducted strange rituals and experiments. It was there that he had made his pact. Determined to uncover the truth, we climbed the stairs to the attic. The door was hidden behind a false wall, but we found it easily enough. Inside, the room was filled with strange artifacts and symbols, remnants of my grandfather's dark dealings. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, similar to the one I had seen earlier. As we approached it, the surface rippled, and we saw my grandfather's reflection staring back at us. His eyes were filled with malice and anger, and he seemed to be trapped within the glass. "This is it," my father said, his voice steady. "This is where it all began." We stood before the mirror, feeling the weight of our family's history pressing down on us. My father raised the locket, and the reflection of my grandfather recoiled. The mirror began to crack, the fractures spreading like spiderwebs across the surface. With a final decisive blow, my father smashed the mirror. The glass shattered, and a dark swirling mist erupted from within. The room filled with a deafening roar, and the air grew icy cold. We held our ground, refusing to be driven back by the dark force that had tormented our family for so long. As the mist began to dissipate, a sense of peace settled over the room. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. We had broken the curse, freeing my grandmother's spirit and ending my grandfather's dark legacy. We left the house on Miller Street for the last time, feeling a sense of closure and relief. My father held the locket tightly, a symbol of the love and forgiveness that had finally healed our family's wounds. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still unanswered questions. My grandfather's dark dealings had left a mark on our family, and I feared that the shadows of the past might still linger, waiting to resurface.